The following content is not intended as a substitute for professional legal advice, medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Always seek the advice of your attorney, advocate, physician, or other qualified health provider with any questions you may have regarding any medical or educational concerns.
Hello, and welcome to the Empower Dyslexia podcast and show. I'm Rachel Chambers.
And I'm Stephen Yearout.
And we're here to help you be a better informed partner in education. On the show, we discuss dyslexia and related disorders, interventions, research, special education policy at a state and federal level, and we also interview experts in the field. So please be sure to like us on Facebook and subscribe to our YouTube channel.
Our goal is 1,000 likes on Facebook and 1,000 likes on YouTube by the end of May.
Yeah.
I mean, currently we're right at almost to 500.
Yeah, so come on,
in
people.
less than 2 months.
Like us,
So
please
share it and put it out there. Put the word out there. Thank you.
So on the show today, we have a very special guest. His name is Dustin Rynders, and he is from Disability Rights Texas. So welcome to the show today, Dustin.
Glad to be here.
Yay. Tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do at Disability Rights Texas.
Sure. So I joined the team at Disability Rights Texas 13 years ago as a staff attorney. And in the most recent years, I've been the supervising attorney over our education team, which just means that I supervise all of the work we do, primarily in special education throughout the state of Texas. That means I supervise both the casework, where we have advocates and attorneys helping individual families in disputes with public schools, and also our policy work. So right now we have both a full-time policy specialist and a policy fellow who are in Austin, trying to educate all the stakeholders about the impact of their decisions on children with disabilities.
Awesome. And I think we have Stephen Aluman, who's the policy advisor down in Austin. He'll be on later today on the show.
Right.
To let us know what's going on in the state legislation.
Yeah, he's been
session
sitting
right
down
now.
at the Capitol every day for a few weeks now. So tell us about the history of special education in the United States.
Sure. So, it started really quite sadly that before the 1970s, many states, and most states, in fact, had some kind of system of fully excluding children with disabilities from public schools. And so in the 1970s, for the first time, we saw parents band together with the assistance of lawyers and bring lawsuits to challenge the constitutionality of these bans on children with disabilities. So they had IQ thresholds, they had what they called educatability standards, where a group of school individuals without a parent present would get to decide whether the child was able to be educated, and there was no requirements of the evaluation that had to be done to make that the case, no requirements that the parent had to be a part of the decision, no ability of the parent to challenge a determination that their child wasn't educatable. They also had ways to exclude children with disabilities based on behavior, not only sending them to a more restrictive setting or disciplining them, which we still struggle with today, but actually fully excluding them from public schools for disability-related behavior. So in the 70s, we had the Park and Mills cases, which created basically the first settlements that required states to open the schoolhouse door to children with disabilities of all kinds. And as a result of Park and Mills, what we now call the Individuals with Disabilities Education Improvement Act was passed. And much of what's in the current federal law originated in these first two constitutional due process challenges to the exclusion of children with disabilities. We moved on from there, and in 1975 also had the Rehabilitation Act, which protects students with disabilities of all kinds, including those students who don't quite need special education services, but still need protected from discrimination of other sorts. After that, we had our first Supreme Court case about the quality of special education that a student should be entitled to under special education. And that was the Amy Rowley case. And Amy Rowley was a deaf student who was very smart, but she wasn't receiving sign language interpreting. And the real issue in that case was whether special education only entitles parents to procedural safeguards and the right to be present at a meeting, or if there is what we call a substantive right to special education, which means you actually have to learn something while you're there, right? Whether there's any kind of quality expectation within the special education laws. The districts at the time were arguing this law is only about due process. It only means that you have an ability to participate and that these certain procedures must be followed. It doesn't actually entitle you to any quality of education.
So what I'm hearing there is that's where the place, not a service, really sounds like it. That's where it started, because that's what we're fighting now. Is special ed is not a place; it's a service. So that's kind of where this whole thing started. It's what I'm hearing.
Yeah, that's right. And right now we know that probably one of the main benefits of special education is if a parent has a concern about the quality of their child's education, they have an ability to challenge it. So if they don't think their child's making progress, they can file a due process hearing request and say, I don't think my child's making enough progress. And so what the Supreme Court did in Rowley is they rejected the school district's argument that there's no right to a quality education. Now, unfortunately, they also rejected Amy Rowley and her parents' argument that it's a higher threshold. They said that because Amy was still doing well in school, even though she would be aided by sign language interpreting, she didn't have to receive the sign language interpreting, which is really quite disappointing. But we have to remember that Amy Rowley was a very bright A and B student. So what the Supreme Court was saying is that if you are passing from grade to grade, you're making A's and B's, you may not get every service that would help you, but you still have a right to an education where you're making progress. So now fast forward a little bit, and we had another really important Supreme Court case only a couple of years ago in the case of Andrew F. And what Andrew did is it was the first time that the Supreme Court had revisited that issue of what is the quality that a child is entitled to of education. And the reason that the Andrew case became so important is that Amy Rowley's case was on behalf of this young woman who was doing really well in school, who didn't have any kind of intellectual disability. And Andrew's case was very different. He was a student with autism who was nonverbal, who spent his entire school day in a self-contained setting. And the parents were arguing that his goals had been the same year after year, and that he really wasn't making any progress. And even though he had a more significant disability, that there was a lot more he could do, and that the schools should have to help him with that. And the lower courts in the state he was from had said, well, it's okay, because as long as he makes at least a little more than de minimis progress, they said, which is basically just very, very little progress, that's enough under the law. And the unanimous Supreme Court of the United States said, no, this is an ambitious law, and you don't get everything that may benefit you, but you have a ability and a right to receive challenging goals and objectives and receive the services so that you make progress that's appropriate in light of this child's circumstances. And so to me, that really clearly raised the bar of what schools are supposed to be aiming for with all of our students, despite their disability category.
Yeah, I think I agree with that. So everybody can reach their full potential. I mean, right? We want to challenge them enough so they're learning, so they can meet their full potential. Am I saying that right?
Yeah. A lot of times we hear the ISDs come back to us and say, we're going to give you the Chevrolet version, not the Cadillac.
Right.
You get what you get, right?
I've heard that several times.
And from what you're saying from this court case, It's saying, no, you have to provide more for this child to make sure that the child is being educated.
And not just getting by at
And
the
not
minimum.
just not put in that place, right? And that's what my biggest problem, and one of the, I mean, even it happened with me when I was in school, being placed into special education or being sent to the special education room as a dyslexic, right? And then I sit around and I look at the kids that are in there, and it's a lot of the kids at that point, it was kids that were supposed to be in self-contained rooms, or I say supposed to, that were for self-contained rooms. And I'm thinking to myself, why am I here? You know, I don't understand. They don't understand what dyslexia is. I don't understand what dyslexia is. So that really sets a precedent for the rest. And we're still dealing with this today when we talk to parents about the difference between 504 and special education. And that, you know, these parents don't want to even consider having their child in special education because of the negative connotation to the word special education. So, you know, that really saddens me that we're still at that point, and that special education term still has such a negative connotation, and people don't even want to talk about it. No, my child's not going to be in special education.
Right.
You know.
Oh, go ahead.
I was going to say special education opens so many doors for a parent. I always tell parents that special education is as good as you become an advocate for it. And sometimes that's a characteristic of the system we have that I don't like, because I do think that families approach their ability to advocate from different positions. And a child whose parents have more obstacles to advocate for them shouldn't receive less services. But unfortunately, that's what we see, is that parents who are able to learn about their rights and face fewer barriers to advocate for their children get a lot more out of special education. So those parents who are concerned about the stigma of special education or about the special education classroom segregation, I mean, those are real concerns, and, you know, parents are right to weigh them. But what I always say in response is special education doesn't have to be that. You can advocate for challenging objectives and for inclusive placements, but that is going to be more work. And so one thing the parent has to know is that the special education does empower them with a lot of procedural safeguards to have a voice in what their child's education looks like, but it's not going to happen automatically. And so, you know, that's one thing to think about.
So the squeaky wheel gets the grease, is what you're saying.
Well, I mean,
If the parents go and advocate actively, and that can sometimes be a full-time job for parents.
I can tell you it's a full-time job, because when I first started diving into how do I get my child help, it was hundreds and hundreds of hours of reading and
the law,
researching and figuring out
people.
What is it that I have to do I have to learn. When I go in these 504 meetings or an ARD meeting, I have to be, for me, right? I have to try to be the smartest person in the room and know as much or more than the people that are sitting across the desk from me.
Because if you don't, you and your child will be at a disadvantage.
So,
they may more than likely than not, give you less services. But if you know,
if you know your rights
and you're informed,
yes.
and you know your rights, and you have a lot of points to talk to and questions to ask, then you're going to get more for your child.
Well, Dustin, I mean, that's the reason for this podcast, is to
That was our whole
disseminate the information to these parents, so they're not drinking from the fire hose. They're not having to go out and spend the hundreds and hundreds of hours trying to understand what it is, or having to go out and spend the money for attorneys or advocates or whatever. Although there are a lot of cases that you
that
need
is fine.
those, right?
Yes, totally.
But there are families out there that don't have that extra money, don't have the knowledge,
extra time,
and you know, it's that saying that I tell schools whenever I talk to them: if you're speaking to a parent that has a child with dyslexia, you probably the chances are you're speaking to a dyslexic are very high, right? And they are probably still dealing with a lot of the emotional side if they didn't get the help that they needed. So the chances of them being able to go out and do a lot of the research and feel confident coming into these meetings and talking to them is very low, right?
Yeah. It's kind of an uphill battle for some.
Dustin, can you talk a little bit about child find?
Sure. So when we talk about child find, it's actually one of those rare pieces of the law where it kind of is exactly what it sounds like. It's the responsibility of every school district and of the Texas Education Agency in its role overseeing the school districts to make sure that every child eligible for special education is found, identified, and offered special education services. And so what's interesting about that is it even includes students who aren't enrolled in public schools. So schools have to make affirmative efforts to go into their communities, go into private schools and preschools and Head Start programs, and basically offer to evaluate children for special education services and serve them.
What about homeschool?
Absolutely. Now, homeschool in Texas is considered a private school. So the characteristic there is you're offering to serve them, which would usually require enrollment. But homeschool students, just like private school students, are eligible for what we call dual enrollment, where essentially you can get related service help from the public school, even if you're otherwise a homeschool student or a private school student.
So let me make sure that I hear this right. You're saying that if you're in a private school, a charter school, homeschool, you're not enrolled in school yet because of your age, parents can go to the ISD that you're living in, that you pay taxes in, and request the testing for special education services under Child Find. Is that correct?
Not with the exception of charter school. I wouldn't put that in the list because
Charter
the
schools
charter school
have to.
is the public school.
True.
And so if you were in a charter school and you needed evaluated for special education, you would go to the charter school and ask them to evaluate you for special education. And they do have to provide special education services, though some of them still don't seem to know that.
Yes, they do.
Well,
Those charters have to.
That was the reason why I said it, because one of the things that I've heard, and correct me if I'm wrong, if the charter school that you're attending in your district, say it's in your district, doesn't provide these type of services, although we all know that they should,
And have to. By state and federal law.
The ISD that you're in and you pay taxes in then picks up that. Is that correct?
So, again, that's a little different if you're in an in-district charter, because if you're in an in-district charter, in many cases, you would live in that same district. But no, I mean, if you are enrolled in a charter school, the charter school itself is responsible for all services that you need under special education. Now, if a parent at some point throws their hands up and says, this isn't working, I'm going to go enroll in the regular public school again, my home campus, that's of course the parent's choice. And then that home district would be responsible for providing their services. But a charter is there is no difference in the law in what a charter is responsible for providing in terms of special education. They have the same obligation to provide a free, appropriate public education to the full range of children with disabilities, even if practically some of them have no experience doing that.
So
thank you for saying that.
Yeah, so make sure that if you're in a charter or you're in pre-K or before pre-K and we say this all the time. If you suspect that there's an issue, make sure that you go out and get your child evaluated.
Yes.
Right?
Most definitely.
If the charter's not providing those services, then make sure that you demand them.
Hold them accountable.
That's right.
Or find some place that will.
So I guess so that really segues into the next question. What makes a child eligible for special education?
Sure. So in Texas, we serve children under special education from age 3 to 22. So 1, you have to fall in that age bracket. 2, you have to have a disability. And there are listed disabilities under the IDEA, but it's an all-expansive list. There's no disability category that doesn't fall somewhere in that list. So it's really that you're 3 to 22, you have a disability, and then the other thing is that you have an educational need for special education. This is where it gets a little tricky, especially with dyslexia. So what is special education? Well, special education is specially designed instruction. And so many people would argue that the types of services and interventions that many, if not all, students with dyslexia will need at some point in their educational journey should qualify as specially designed instruction. What's tricky in Texas is that for many years, dyslexia interventions were provided in separate programming called dyslexia services, and that our state was failing to evaluate almost any children with dyslexia and consider them for special education eligibility. The Department of Education has made it very clear that what Texas was doing, basically excluding dyslexia from special education, was definitely against the law. Texas has recently updated its dyslexia handbook to refer to the potential need to evaluate a child for school special education services repeatedly, but it may not go far enough because many in our state feel like, really, if we suspect dyslexia, we should be doing a full individual evaluation like you would for special ed on the front end. And that's still not happening in most places in our state. But the eligibility criteria are disability, age 3 to 22, and an educational need for specially designed instruction.
Yeah, you were saying, I just completely lost. Sorry, my ADD kicked in.
Dyslexia. I'm trying to get back on track.
Anyway, sorry. Go ahead.
So just for clarification, I've heard that dyslexia or dyslexics are served under 504, under the dyslexia law, and not special education. Unless they qualify for special education, meaning that they have dyslexia and another related disorder, whether it be speech or ADHD or dysgraphia.
Yeah, but I thought that was changed, though, that you don't have to have a comorbidity. Is comorbidity
You definitely don't have to have any kind of comorbidity. And here's the weird thing. You never had to under federal law, but Texas just broke the federal law for many years. Yeah. And so, that's the reality, is that you only have to have one disability. You don't have to have two. Dyslexia is a specific learning disability, which is a category specifically laid out in federal law. Mm-hmm. And so, absolutely, a student can have dyslexia alone and be eligible for special education. And districts, I think, at this point, overall know that, but then the real question is, does this child who has dyslexia, if the evaluations are clear that the child has dyslexia, the question is, well, do they have a need for specially designed instruction? And so, say that student is receiving pull-out reading interventions that are specific to dyslexia. In my opinion, that is specially designed instruction. I mean, it sounds special.
It sounds special to me.
It sounds special. Even if it was push in. I mean, it's not about the distinction of whether you're in a special ed class or whether you're in a regular education class. However, unfortunately, the guidance from the Texas Education Agency so far, the reason I say so far is our state is still under Department of Education oversight because of our years of excluding children with many disabilities who were eligible for special ed services. So there's always the chance that this guidance could change. What TEA is telling districts right now, and so what districts are hearing, is that if you are providing dyslexia services, so you're pulling out and doing dyslexia services, that is not necessarily specially designed instruction.
How is it? So how is it not? I mean, I don't understand that. How is it not specially designed?
I disagree with it. So to me, the group of people with dyslexia that I would acknowledge may not be eligible for special ed are people whose dyslexia has already been remediated to the point that they're no longer needing to be pulled out and receive specially designed instruction, and that they just need kind of basic accommodations. In that case, to me, I think there's a pretty good case that student can be properly served under 504.
I would agree.
I agree with that.
the pressure that we have in our state is that, of course, for many years, because of the history of special education, especially resource rooms and life skills rooms, not always providing specially designed instruction, but sometimes being used to warehouse or lower standards, people who you were talking about, parents who themselves experienced that, are reluctant to be in special education, have their kids in special education. So there's been a lot of advocacy over the years from people in the dyslexia community who disagree about this question of whether to serve people in special education or whether to serve people in 504. Under the law, every decision we're supposed to make, from eligibility to programming, is supposed to be individualized. I think that one of the problems Texas got in through many years of treating dyslexia differently and separately is that people are also used to only looking at reading. So when we look at school discipline data, the group that is disciplined almost as much as students with emotional disturbance in Texas are students with specific learning disabilities. So we know that many students with dyslexia have other accommodation and support needs outside of reading instruction.
Right.
And yet, even when we have this debate about whether the reading instruction we provide is specially designed instruction or not, we should still not lose track of the fact that some not insignificant group of students with dyslexia will have behavior support needs. Well, if you need a behavior intervention plan to make progress in your schooling, that is another need for specially designed instruction. Some percentage of students may also need interventions for co-occurring disabilities. So it is important that districts evaluate when they suspect a child of having a disability, that it be a full evaluation, and that an ARD committee, including the parent, consider the whole child and make a determination about what specially designed instruction they need or don't need.
Love it.
And so the point I was going to make earlier is in all of the conversations that I've had with evaluators, or they have told me at no point have they ever found somebody who was
just dyslexic.
So there is other issues that are going on in that whole child approach, trying to figure out exactly how can we support this child, the child, not the dyslexia, and what other services that they need.
Yep.
I love the fact that you said, this thing, you need to look at the child first and then have the ARD committee decide, is this child better served under special education, or can they be served under 504? Right. But at that point, you have a choice, right? You're not being pushed one way or the other.
One of the things when we talk about all of these issues, there's a tendency to pretend that we're not really talking about money. But in fact, we usually are talking about school funding in every issue we discuss. And this is no exception. So if you ask school associations what their main concern about, it's that dyslexia services have been required by schools, and schools have not traditionally recouped almost any of the money for providing those services. Now, one way to remedy that is to provide clearer guidance to schools that yes, a high percentage, if not all, of the students with dyslexia in your district should likely be eligible for special education, which also happens to allow the district to recoup more of the cost of the dyslexia services that some of them are already providing or that they need to be providing. However, at the Texas legislature, there are also some people who have a competing approach to try to remedy the problem of schools not having dyslexia services funded, but to do it outside of special education funding. And so, many districts are, and I don't envy them, confused right now at what they're getting out of TEA. These really gray answers on questions of is dyslexia in special ed or not. They're not getting super clear answers. They're having to decide how they're going to try to fund services in their districts. I think some of them have some misunderstandings that I don't think are that relevant. So some of them are concerned that maybe they have dyslexia instructors who are not certified special education teachers. And I think some districts fear that if I qualify a student under special education, then I can't give them dyslexia instruction with a general educator who is trained in dyslexia instruction but isn't a certified special ed teacher. I think that that's a really silly concern. We've always let our committees decide whether a child needs to be in a special education class or a general education class, but that does get to the heart of some of our confusion because of the way our system was built. Many of the people who currently provide instruction in dyslexia settings are not necessarily special education teachers. Traditionally, when we talk about specially designed instruction, people think about resource behavior settings and life skill settings that have certified special education teachers. But we should all know at this point in 2019 that a student can be served in general education all day long and still receive specially designed instruction from their general education teacher. And so this shouldn't be a barrier to eligibility. Unfortunately, I fear that it's some of what's driving the continued confusion and some of the barrier to making more kids eligible.
We were at an event not long ago, and that was one of the things that we kept hearing, that you can't provide special or dyslexia services in special education.
Right.
And, we had...
I've had that told me a couple of times that dyslexia is not in special education. And if a child in special education needs dyslexia intervention, they can't get it. They'll deny him the intervention, or I guess have to finagle some way of getting it out of the general education. But it's muddy. It's not clear how the schools are supposed to handle these kids that need it.
And that's the big problem when you leave loopholes in laws or guidance or anything else. I understand that you have to make these things very broad to allow some creativity to provide services. But here's the thing: if you leave those loopholes, somebody's going to figure out, just like you were talking about, it's about money. When you come down to it, it's about money. And how do we pay for, these extra head counts and these services and this, that, and the other? So, we need guidance from the people who are writing these laws. Stop the loopholes. Say what you mean.
Make it black and white as much as possible.
Right.
So the teachers know how to do it and have clear understanding, instructions, and
if we don't have guidance from our state legislation, we don't have real guidance from TEA.
None,
and
as far as this is concerned.
Now the Department of Education saying one thing. We have 3 different versions of what it is that these schools are supposed to be doing, and we don't have. The schools definitely aren't going to step out and risk their neck to get chopped off if they're not sure what to do. Right, and then it takes parents.
Yeah, our state is so
really
in limbo
fight.
right now.
It takes. Go ahead.
I think the other thing we have is an honest shortage of evaluation professionals.
That's true.
And so, what some districts have told me is that they like the idea of putting more children in special education in terms of it providing a path to funding the dyslexia services that they've been struggling to fund. And at the same time, those districts say, but how would I ever conduct a full individual evaluation on the number of students that we have in our current dyslexia programs? We just don't have the diagnosticians and school psychologists. Some percentage of those districts say that they posted positions, that they don't receive enough applicants, that the districts are competing over the same evaluation professionals. TEA has released a request for proposal, and I believe selected a provider who is trying to make school evaluation personnel available to districts to kind of meet this need and fill this gap. I think that there's probably more that we all need to do to encourage the legislature and other stakeholders to find ways to encourage more people to go into the profession, to stay into the profession. I've heard from some special education administrators that, you have some qualified licensed people that have gone into retirement, but that the barriers to coming out of retirement and taking a position in the teacher retirement system are too steep. So that may be one thing that could help fill in a kind of a temporary stopgap until we have more evaluation professionals to serve the true needs of our state.
Yeah, that's a good idea. So let's jump to the next question. So do students receiving services under 504 have the same protections as students receiving services under special education? Can you explain the differences there?
Quickly, no. And so, special education is different in the robustness of the procedural and due process safeguards. So what I mean by that is, yes, in theory, children in 504 are supposed to be entitled to a free, appropriate public education. There is no special education service that you absolutely can't get under 504. If a district were willing to provide a service to a child in 504, there's no barrier to them doing it just because the child's not in special ed as a matter of law. However, practically, school districts receive no extra funding for students in 504. So that alone tells you what you need to know, which is that most children in 504 receive no significant extra services to help them learn. The Houston Chronicles Denied series, which brought to light TEA's 8.5% cap. I'm proud that I'm the one who told the Chronicle about this story. One of their findings is that the Texas districts who they studied were spending about $2 extra per year per student for a 504 student. So I think that we all have a good sense that you're not going to get much that's going to help you for $2. It's essentially the paperwork alone is the expenditure there, and maybe a district coordinator of services, for example. And so the other challenge with 504 is that if at some point you want to challenge the implementation of your 504 plan or the sufficiency of your 504 plan, your options are not nearly as good as they are under special education. You can file a complaint with the Office of Civil Rights at the Department of Education. Sometimes those complaints sit for as long as 3 years. Well, that's not much help to any child to have a complaint that sits for years at the Department of Education Office of Civil Rights. It's still important that the Department of Education hear from people, though, so I don't want a parent to hear that and not complain.
So I will tell you this. I talked to a parent who filed a OCR complaint, Office of Civil Rights complaint. Literally within 2 months, she heard back from them, and they were already investigating it and have already, the district has already entered into a self-resolution with OCR. I mean, it was 2 months. I was floored that it was that quick, because just like you said, I've seen and heard that it's years to get anything done through that process.
And by the time, that child has just lost so much time of needed services. So it's not an ideal situation.
Get an investigation open, but I even want you to compare the fairly positive story that you heard about that OCR with what we have in special education. In special education, if you filed a written special education complaint with the Texas Education Agency, they have to reach a decision on your complaint within 60 days.
Wow.
So even though it's positive that in OCR, we at least hear that an investigator is willing to look at it, compare that within the same time period in special education, you get a decision. Right. And so it's still very different procedurally. Now, one of the benefits of filing a complaint is it always has the possibility that it gets the issue in front of someone in the district who's resolution oriented and wants to fix it. And so that's one of the reasons that I would still encourage parents to file complaints. Similarly, let's talk about due process. So, if you have the kind of issue that you might need expert opinions on and they are not clear-cut violations, it's often better to request a hearing of some kind. Well, technically, you can request a hearing under 504 or a hearing under special education, but let's look at the differences. In special education, your hearing officer is appointed either by the State Office of Administrative Hearings or by the Texas Education Agency. In 504, the school district gets to select and hire a hearing officer. So the person that you're complaining against gets to select the hearing officer. Well, that doesn't give a lot of us confidence in the 504 hearing process. And so there's really different accountability requirements. Additionally, we talked earlier about the importance of doing thorough evaluation into a child, a full individual evaluation. One of the rights that you have in special education is that anytime the school district conducts an evaluation of any sort, a special education evaluation of any sort, and the parent disagrees with that evaluation, the parent has a right to request an independent evaluation by a qualified person of their choice at school district expense. And that is one of the most powerful rights in special education. And there is no similar right in 504. And in fact, very oftentimes in 504, no true assessment is done.
Right.
That doesn't mean that assessment can't be done under 504. But again, we're then talking about a law that is primarily an anti-discrimination law that gives you rights to basic accommodations. And it is not designed to provide specially designed instruction, costly services, a robust system of enforcement. And so the two statutes really are very, very different.
They really are.
So you talked about the 8.5 cap. And when I started investigating districts in Texas and going, combing through all the PEMS data, when I saw this story, I went and started looking at that same thing, and I was like, wait, there's some validity to it, because it was so, to me, when I first heard the story, I was like, it was conspiracy theory that surely that can't be right. Right. And
why would they do that? That sounds
crazy,
terrible.
Right. So I start combing through I downloaded every district in Texas, all their PEMS data, and started, combing through it all. And it was right. I mean, almost every one of them were hovering right around that 8.5.
Yeah.
And I was just blown away.
Yeah.
So you talked a little bit about that. Can you give us some more information? You had said that you had given that information to the Houston Chronicle.
Yeah.
Yes, it was funny when you were telling that story about not believing it at first until you looked into it yourself. That's the exact same response I received from Brian Rosenthal, who was the excellent reporter who was at the Chronicle at that time and is now at the New York Times. And Brian had come to my office to talk through several potential investigative journalism issues that he might want to look into. And so I pitched the 8.5% cap as well as a few other issues. And he left my office intrigued, but in disbelief. And so he went away thinking, I don't know if this guy that I talked to seems to know quite a bit, but is he a conspiracy theorist? Is any of this true? And he calls me probably a week later and says, I've been looking into everything you said and you didn't make it up. It's all true. And of course, I knew I hadn't made it up. And I knew that the real life experience of families who have been calling Disability Rights Texas for years is that people couldn't get evaluated no matter how hard they tried, and that it appeared to be because bad guidance from the Texas Education Agency and this really de facto 8.5% cap we had in our state. I don't know if you have the chart.
Slide 3.
Yeah, Jason, could you put up slide 3?
So what was so interesting about this is when we said, why would someone do this? What we learned through the Chronicle investigation and what Brian was able to do that I wouldn't have been able to do as easily was to get so many courageous educators to go on record and tell the stories, and former TA officials who said it was always about money. And so what we see in this chart is that the cap was instituted in 2004. And so you can see that Texas, the yellow line, was back in the early 90s, just slightly lower than the rest of the United States. But then they introduced this cap in 2004. And then after 2004, districts very efficiently dropped the special education eligibility rate in our state from about 11% right down to right below the 8.5% cap that the Texas Education Agency had created. And so when the cap was in place, what districts receive kind of a report card of types that gives them indicators on all sorts of measurements. And that includes graduation rates and ELL services. It also includes special education. And within special education, they had assigned the best possible score a district could receive to districts who kept their eligibility rate to below 8.5%. Interestingly, they had no countervailing force that would ever punish a district or require any type of corrective action if the district was even serving 0% of their students in special education. And so the incentive and the clear message from TEA was to save our state really hundreds of millions of dollars over this time period by denying as many children as possible the special education services that they so greatly needed.
So Dustin, why do you think they did this? It was just all about funding? And
I think it's about funding.
What did they want to do with the money that they did get from the federal government for special education? I mean, where did that money go? Because we're allotted so much money.
There is some misperception in that question, I think. Special education you receive federal funding, but a majority of the funding has to come from the state and the district. And so, many people have long felt that special education is an unfunded mandate, that the federal government sets up all of these requirements, but gives states relatively little money. And I agree with that criticism. I think that the federal government should be paying a higher percentage of the cost of special education. And at the same time, it never has. And for students with disabilities, the important things is that our state treat those students with disabilities in our state the way that they should. And Texas is overall a low investment state in education across the board, special education and general education. We spend much lower than a majority of the nation. It seems like an issue that this Texas legislative session, there's fairly good bipartisan consensus on improving funding for education in Texas. But there are a million priorities within education. Do we want to give teachers raises? Do we want to provide universal pre-K? Do we want to properly fund special education in our state?
Yes, we do.
And so, legislators have important decisions to make. And families who feel strongly about where this money needs to be spent need to make their voices heard and let them know their children's story, and that legislatures should prioritize the type of funding they think would help their children.
I mean, we're all for all the extracurricular activities, all of the other stuff that
benefits our children.
The districts provide. We're all for that, except for pay for what your main goal is, which is educate our children, right? Pay for that first, and then all the rest of the money, do whatever. But make sure that you're funding these programs appropriately.
Yeah.
So one of the things I think is really important for everyone to know is that as part of the corrective action plan that the Texas Education Agency has been required to come up with because of the Department of Education's finding that Texas violated the law with the 8.5% cap and denying almost 400,000 Texas children special ed services they needed. As a part of this corrective action plan, TEA has promised to increase their monitoring throughout the state, to go back to making on-site visits at districts every several years. They've had to hire a lot more staff to do that. They also acknowledge that we're going to have more children in our state in special education going forward, so that's going to require additional costs to meet those needs. TEA, so the system itself, is estimating that $3.2 billion additional dollars are needed for special education alone. And that is what they have requested from the Texas legislature. And That was done a number of months ago, but recent stories about school finance aren't highlighting special education as one of the primary education
No, they're
needs.
still on pre-K and
They're still on these
stuff
other
like
issues,
that.
which I don't doubt the importance of, but I
Right,
think
right.
it's really important in the disability community that people know that this isn't automatic. I want to believe we have the wind at our back because of the oversight from the Department of Education and the fact that TEA knows they have to make big changes in special ed in our state. At the same time, families need to make their voices heard
Well,
and say that we need to fully fund special education.
So I do want to tell our listeners and viewers that Texas was and is the only state in the union that's ever been under investigation by the federal government for this denying of students. So Dustin, my question to you, how do we find the denied students and get them the services they so desperately need?
So, I think that we start, what I've instructed school special education directors to do is to look first at the students you have in 504 in your district. So you already know that every child in your 504 program meets the age for special education, has a disability, and the real question for them is, well, do they have an educational need? So when you go through that list of 504 students, ask questions about, first and foremost, how's this kid doing? Is this kid been held back? Are they getting in trouble at school? How are their grades? And what I have heard from candid school special education directors and 504 coordinators who have taken me up on that task or have otherwise started it on their own is that very often you're going to find a lot of kids who are in 504, have a disability and who are quite frankly struggling because they're not getting what they need.
Right.
And so start with the 504 kids, but also I encourage districts, and I know this seems overwhelming to them, to partner with the juvenile probation offices in their counties. Very sadly, kids who don't receive the services they need are more likely to be referred to juvenile justice. And so while certainly many of those bad outcomes could have been averted if we delivered effective services earlier, let's try to reach them if we can still find them. And so our office has a partnership with the Harris County Probation Department to provide educational advocacy to probation-involved youth. And one of the key issues that we face all the time is child fine. Kids who are taking medication, who need services, and we have to counsel their parents on how to get that process rolling. So make
Awesome.
Partnerships like that.
So
That's wonderful.
So we would like for our viewers here, especially here in Texas, to have a call to action. What would your top 3 call to actions be for our parents?
So I would love every parent who is concerned about these issues to weigh in with their stakeholders, their legislators and other elected officials, and let them know what their priorities are regarding special education. And so if you think that the state needs to better fund special education, make your voice heard there. If you're concerned about the fact that dyslexia is still being served to a large degree outside of special education, make your voice heard on that question. If you take a different view and you would like dyslexia to be served in the separate program but funded, make your voice heard on it. People need to know that these issues have not been fixed. The Chronicle had their award-winning series, but we are not in the clear yet. There is still a lot of work ahead, and without families just speaking out, I think that they're not going to change as much as they need to. Secondly, I'd say, for your own child and those in your community, check out disabilityrightstexas.org, drtx.org, as a shortcut. We have a ton of resources there, our special education IDEA guide, as well as short videos in English, Spanish, and sign language with practical advocacy tips. If you are getting to a point where your child's own educational program's in good shape, think about volunteering and becoming an advocate for others. And I think that's really where I'd leave it. And I thank you for what you're doing and getting this good information, not only today, but in your other episodes out to the community as well.
Thank you very much.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dustin. We very much appreciate you being on the show today. You gave us so much cool information and that we desperately need. Our parents, our state, and our country need this information to know what's going on and what they can do about it. So we appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So speaking of policy, it's now time for our legislative update with Stephen Aldman.
From Disability Rights Texas as well.
Disability Rights Texas. Let's hear what Stephen has to say.
Hello, my name is Stephen Aldman. I'm an attorney and policy specialist with a nonprofit organization known as Disability Rights Texas. I'm headquartered in Austin, Texas, and Disability Rights Texas advocates on behalf of people with disabilities. My focus at Disability Rights Texas is public education and meeting the needs of students with disabilities. I'm just going to take a moment to talk about our 86th legislative session and give everyone an update specifically about special education and students with disabilities. Just a quick update and rundown about where we are right now in the legislative session. Of course, things officially began back in early January, on January 8th, when the legislative session began. For those lawmakers who were already in office, however, they started filing bills back in early November of last fall. November 12th was the official day that incumbents who were reelected could start submitting legislation. That's interesting because just this week, the House Public Education Committee held its first hearing on legislation, including several bills connected to students with disabilities. And most of those bills were filed in what we call that early legislative filing session, or sometimes called pre-filing before the actual session. So lawmakers are still working on bills for those who did not get an early start in November and December, but the deadline is coming up very fast. On Friday, March 8th, just a week or two from now, all lawmakers have to have their legislation on file. So anyone who has any ideas about a bill should be talking with their lawmakers or finalizing plans to get that legislation submitted through a lawmaker. Otherwise, it's just simply too late, and any legislative ideas will have to wait another 2 years until 2021. So now that we are very close to having all potential legislation submitted by lawmakers, the next step in the process are legislative hearings by the respective Texas Senate Committee on Education and the Texas House Public Education Committee. The general process is to take public testimony on those pieces of legislation, then in a secondary meeting, allow the lawmakers on that committee to talk about the bills and talk about the testimony received. So if you want to be involved in this process, this is the time to start paying attention to those hearing notices. Just to let you know that the House Public Education Committee and Senate Education Committees are meeting on Tuesdays. Typically, public testimony is not starting until the afternoon, but which bills are being considered are usually not announced until the week, at the end of the week preceding. So like last Friday, we found out what bills would be considered this Tuesday, just the other day. So you do have to be diligent about checking the list, but there's several bills already that have come up. For instance, there was a bill about allowing students with disabilities to be granted endorsements as part of our high school diploma program, even if the course is modified in its curriculum. There was another bill filed and heard about making sure that teachers, including regular education teachers, receive all the training they need to make sure that students with disabilities in their regular classrooms and mainstream classrooms are as equipped as possible to translate lesson plans and curriculum for students with disabilities, so they get access to the regular coursework that all other students are getting access to. So that's a really big bill about a general education teacher training bill focused on the needs of students with disabilities. Let's remember that special education is a service, not a place. So as we go forward, we'll start to see many of those kinds of bills coming up. But obviously the two big topics still have not yet been flushed out in legislation this session. The two big education topics where there'll be components devoted to students with disabilities, of course, are school finance reform, as well as school safety. Going back to last year's tragedy in Santa Fe, Texas, with the high school shooting, there's a lot of emphasis on school safety. Connected to that is mental health well-being of students, but also how do you sort of trace students who might be a danger to themselves and others in schools, and try to alert authorities early about potentially dangerous behavior. Of course, we all want safe schools. The concern, however, among special education advocates is that will unfairly target students with emotional disabilities or students who have a lack of social skills, perhaps, where they might say something they don't really mean, or it's misinterpreted that they're trying to hurt somebody at school. In regard to school funding reform, school finance reform, of course, the big question is, will public schools receive the adequate resources to serve students with disabilities, to meet the needs identified in IEPs? Typically, most of that cost is covered at the local level. What can the state do to better support that system so kids have access to the services they really need? As we wind through this process of both considering bills that change Texas education law, I also want to point out that the state budget is on its own separate track for enactment. In Texas, we adopt a 2-year budget. And while many people think of that as just simply how much money we're going to spend, there are also many policy issues that are addressed because of set aside funds for particular initiatives or killing off prior initiatives. So students with disabilities, for instance, had two particular earmarks last session: students with autism and students with dyslexia, where the legislature funded about 20 pilot programs in school districts. And so this go around, for instance, that special money will be reconsidered, as well as new money to deal with the special education crisis in Texas. Obviously, everyone, or presume everyone knows that there was a finding by the U.S. Department of Education against Texas for violating federal special ed law. As a response, the Texas Education Agency created a new 5-year plan to try to bring the state into compliance and improve services to students with disabilities. And a big budget issue is how do we pay for all of the activities identified in that plan? It's great if we have a plan, but if it just sits on the shelf or there's no money to actually implement it, then it's really not much of a plan, right? So in the budget process, there's also going to be attention paid to students with disabilities and services. So all of this activity is occurring during what we call the regular session. And so this regular session, as I mentioned, started on January 8th. And the very last day of the regular session is May 27th, which I believe is Memorial Day. So already we're through 2 months almost of the regular session with 3 more months to go. And again, the filing deadline for all legislation coming up on March 8th. And then we'll get down to business and start sorting through all those bills, especially those connected to students with disabilities, and see what changes we might expect in the coming school year. Any bills that do pass into law this legislative session will not take effect and apply until the 2019-2020 school year. So obviously with this school year already winding down in the spring semester, any changes in law do not usually take effect immediately. We wait until the subsequent school year. So I hope that information is helpful to the viewers. I'll just leave you with a website that I would encourage everyone to turn to. That's called Texas Legislative Online, Texas Legislature Online. We call it TLO for short. If you Google that, you find the state's website that allows you to access all information about committee meetings, all pieces of legislation, and how you can participate as a citizen by registering as a witness at hearings. So that's a great resource for everyone should be aware of if you want to take any interest in state lawmaking connected to education and students with disabilities. So that's it for now from Austin, as we are now almost 2 months into this legislative session. And we'll be back to keep people updated, especially once the regular session concludes, to summarize all the key pieces of legislation. Take care, everyone.
And thank you so much to Stephen Alyaman from Disability Rights Texas. Thank you for that update. Parents, you heard them. If you have concerns, go out to contact your Congress people, your legislators, and express your concerns to them. It's important.
So let's jump right into events. This Saturday, Success Conference, Go Get It. It's a free event at Wiley High School from 10 to 2. Come see me. I'll be speaking on accessing disability. I'll be speaking on accessing dyslexia services, if I could speak. And again, that's from 10 to 2 at Wiley High School.
This Saturday. And then Soaring to New Heights, Stand Up, Speak Out, Student Workshop. It's Saturday, February 23rd again from 3 to 6 at the Kavanaugh Flight Museum in Addison, Texas. It'll be led by Eric McGarity with help from volunteer teachers, parents, and teen student leaders. It should be all about advocating and teaching your child to advocate for themselves, among other things. For more information on these events, please visit our website. It's www.empowerdyslexia.info.
So that's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much to Dustin for joining us. Mm-hmm. Please like us on Facebook, subscribe to us on YouTube channel. Please help us get to that 1,000 subscriber like goal.
Yes, that's our goal by the end of May. Yeah, and comment. We want to hear from you. If you like it, if you don't like it, if you want us to talk about something, let us know your concerns. We would love to hear from you. Love to hear from you and help if we can help in any way.
We always close with this. If you suspect that your child has a disability or starting to see those signs,
they're struggling in school,
make sure that you go get your child evaluated. Mm-hmm. It's a very simple process. You'll be happy that you did. Your child will be happy with it you did. We have some sample letters of evaluation request form on our website, www.empowerdyslexia.info. And again, we have the list of events there too. So
So if you missed something that we were talking about, go back to our website.
So that's all the time we have. We'll see you next Thursday.
See you then.